The very sun hung heavy over the limestone walls of the ancient city, casting long, jagged shadows across the pavement of the great marketplace. In the center of this chaotic symphony of shouting traders and bleating livestock stood Elias. He was a man carved from the very marble of his own palace. He was cold, unyielding, and impeccably polished. To the common laborer, Elias was more than a merchant. He was a force of nature, a predator who could scent a fluctuation in the price of spice from afar. He moved through the crowd, not as a participant, but as a king inspecting a conquered territory. Every coin that changed hands seemed to vibrate with his influence, and every deal struck in the shadow of the temple gates eventually found its way into his ledgers. For Elias, life was not measured in breaths or heartbeats, but in the rhythmic clinking of gold against gold, a sound that provided the only music he truly cared to hear. Despite the opulence that draped his shoulders in fine silks, a hollow hunger gnawed at his vitals. Elias was possessed by a singular ghost, the legacy of King Solomon. He spent his nights poring over historical accounts of the legendary monarch's wealth, memorizing the gold that arrived from Ophir and the ivory thrones that once graced the royal courts. He did not seek Solomon's wisdom, he sought his ledger. To Elias, more money was the only shield against the whims of fate, a fortress that could never be breached. However, this fortress was becoming a prison. In the quiet hours, when the city fell silent, Elias found no rest. Chronic insomnia had become his constant companion, a tax he paid for his soaring ambitions. He would lie awake, staring at the ornate ceiling, calculating interests and plotting the ruin of competitors, while his wife Sarah slept on the other side of a widening emotional chasm. His children had become strangers, their laughter sounding like a distraction rather than a joy. One afternoon, while inspecting antiquities from a desert tomb, Elias's attention was drawn to a heavy chest of cedar and brass. As he ran his calloused fingers over a hidden seam in the base, a secret compartment clicked open. Inside lay a single weathered scroll, wrapped in stained linen that smelled of dust and forgotten centuries. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Elias unrolled the parchment with trembling hands, his eyes widening as he recognized the seal of a royal scribe. The ink was faded, but the words were clear, claiming to reveal the one thing Solomon feared more than poverty. This was the secret he had been searching for, the missing piece of the puzzle that would finally elevate him above the status of a mere merchant and into the realm of legends. As Elias read the opening lines, the very air inside the warehouse grew inexplicably cold. The scroll did not speak of gold mines or trade routes, it spoke of the soul. It suggested that the greatest king lived in a state of quiet terror, not of losing his kingdom, but of something far more insidious that dwelled within the heart of every man who sought to own the world. Elias gripped the parchment, his knuckles turning white. He felt a sudden, sharp, and inexplicable urge to hide the document, to keep its contents away from the prying eyes of the world. Just as he tucked the scroll into his tunic, a shiver raced down his spine. He turned his gaze toward the marketplace. There, standing perfectly still amidst the swirling current of people, was a shadowy figure draped in a tattered cloak. The figure did not move, did not shout, and did not trade. It simply watched. Its eyes, though obscured by the hood, seemed to bore directly into Elias's conscience, acknowledging the forbidden knowledge he now possessed. Elias stepped back into the darkness of his storehouse, the weight of the scroll feeling like a leaden stone against his chest. Realizing that his journey towards Solomon's wealth had just taken a turn into territory he was not yet prepared to navigate. The hunt for gold had ended. The trial had finally begun. Elias retreated to the sanctuary of his private chambers. the heavy cedar doors shutting out the persistent hum of the ancient city. By the flickering light of an oil lamp, he unrolled the ancient parchment once more. His eyes skipped over the warnings of the soul and landed on a passage that seemed to glow with divine permission. The hand of the diligent makes rich. To a man whose identity was forged in the fires of commerce, these words were not a spiritual guide, but a tactical manual. He did not see the balance of a quiet life. He saw a command for relentless, unceasing production. He believed that if a little diligence brought wealth, then total, suffocating diligence would bring the legendary abundance of Solomon himself. This was his mandate, his biblical way to ensure that no rival could ever cast a shadow over his throne. He felt a surge of cold energy, a conviction that his previous pace had been laziness. The next dawn did not bring the usual measured start. Instead, it brought a storm of commands that shook the warehouse foundations. Elias paced the floors, his voice cutting through the mist like a whip. He demanded that porters double their loads and scribes forgo their midday bread. The rhythm of the warehouse, once a steady pulse of organized trade, became a frantic, desperate gallop. Men who had served him for years looked at him with hollow eyes, their muscles trembling under the weight of crates filled with silks and spices. Elias saw none of their fatigue. He only saw the potential for more, the numbers in his ledger expanding like a rising tide. He convinced himself that he was doing them a favor, teaching them the way of prosperity through sheer effort. To Elias, every single drop of sweat was merely a lubricant for the gears of his empire. Caleb, his loyal foreman, watched this transformation with growing horror. He found Elias in the counting room, surrounded by stacks of silver. Caleb's face was etched with the weariness of a man who carried the burdens of his workers on his own shoulders. He spoke softly, reminding Elias of the days when they shared water and dreams. He warned that the men were breaking, that the spirit of work had been replaced by a grinding fear. Work without heart is just slavery. Elias, Caleb said, his voice thick with a grief the merchant could not comprehend. Elias did not look up from his scales. He laughed, a dry and brittle sound, accusing Caleb of being soft. The argument escalated bitterly, ending with Elias questioning Caleb's loyalty and Caleb's silent realization that the man he once called a brother was being consumed by the very gold he worshipped. The breaking point came during a suffocatingly hot evening. A young laborer, his eyes glazed with exhaustion, lost his footing on a ladder while retrieving a jar of Phoenician oil. The sound of pottery was followed by a sickening thud that silenced the entire warehouse. As the workers moved toward their fallen comrade, Elias pushed through the crowd, but he did not kneel beside the injured boy. He did not offer a word of comfort. Instead, his gaze fixed on the shimmering pool of oil spreading across the floor. He cursed the waste, calculating the loss of the shipment in his head, demanding to know who was responsible for the ruined inventory. The silence that followed was heavier than stone. The men looked at him with a profound, chilling disgust. They saw a man who had lost his humanity in the pursuit of a shadow. Later that night, Elias stood before a polished bronze mirror. The flickering lamp cast dancing shadows across his features, making him look older, harder. He looked for the man who loved his family, but he found only a stranger with cold, predatory eyes. He saw the diligent hand he had cultivated, and for the first time, he noticed it was stained with the sweat of those who had once trusted him. The realization brought a paralyzing numbness. A knock at the door broke his trance. It was Caleb. He did not come to argue. He placed his keys on the table, his eyes reflecting a deep disappointment. Caleb walked away without a word, leaving Elias standing alone in a palace of silence. Surrounded by wealth, but possessing no one he could trust. The shadow in the marketplace was no longer outside. It had moved into his soul. Elias sat in the heavy silence left by Caleb's departure. the gold on his table seeming less like a hard-earned trophy and more like a cold, indifferent audience to his growing isolation. To drown out the nagging voice of his conscience and the lingering image of the injured laborer, he turned once again to the weathered scroll. His fingers trembled as he unrolled the next section, hoping for a strategy to rebuild his fractured prestige and replace the void left by his former friend. He found instead a stern warning that felt like a bucket of icy water. The text spoke of the dangers of being a surety for another, of striking hands in pledge and being snared by the words of one's own mouth. It advised the reader to deliver themselves like a gazelle from the hand of the hunter. To Elias, however, this sounded like the timid caution of a man who had never tasted the thrill of a grand gamble. He misinterpreted the ancient wisdom as a challenge, believing his superior intellect would allow him to outmaneuver any hunter. He convinced himself that he was not a gazelle. He was the lion of the marketplace, and rules intended for the weak did not apply to his ambition. This hubris was exactly what the rival merchant had been waiting for. This man, a smooth-tongued traveler with eyes like polished obsidian, arrived at Elias's gates not with the dusty garments of a common trader, but with the calculated opulence of a man who breathed success. He spoke of a secret trade route to the distant lands of Ophir, promising a fleet of ships laden with peacocks, ivory, and enough gold to make Solomon's legendary temple look like a pauper's hut. The rival merchant didn't ask for a small investment. He asked for a partnership of equals, claiming he only needed a man of Elias's stature to guarantee the venture to the city's high creditors. The deal required Elias to stake his entire estate, his warehouses, his palace, and even the very land his family slept upon, as a pledge for the massive initial capital. The merchant felt a sharp pang of the scroll's warning. The image of the hunter's snare flashing briefly in his mind, but he pushed it aside with a sneer. This was his chance to silence the whispers in the city and prove that he alone was the true heir to Solomon's wisdom. Before the ink could dry on the parchment of the pledge, Sarah entered the hall. She had watched her husband's slow descent into obsession with a breaking heart. Seeing the lines of greed etch themselves deeper into his face each day, she didn't even look at the rival merchant. Her eyes, filled with a mixture of pity and desperation, were fixed solely on Elias. She spoke of the children, who now hid when they heard their father's footsteps, and of the simple joy of a meal shared without the shadow of ledgers. She reminded him that a house of stone is just a tomb if it is not filled with peace. Her voice was a soft, melodic contrast to the harsh, metallic reality Elias was creating for himself. She begged him to let the deal go, to be content with their already vast holdings, and to bring back the man who used to laugh with his friend Caleb. But Elias saw her concern only as a lack of vision and a feminine fear of greatness. He told her that he was building a legacy that would last for generations, failing to see that he was burning the very foundation that legacy was supposed to stand upon. With a firm, dismissive wave of his hand, he signaled for her to leave, his heart hardening against the only person who still truly saw his soul. He signed the pledge with a flourish, the heavy seal of his house pressing into the wax like a final nail. The rival merchant smiled, a slow, predatory expression that should have chilled Elias to the bone. Yet the merchant only saw a reflection of his own perceived triumph. Within a week, the silence of the palace became oppressive. The promised reports of the fleet's departure did not arrive. Elias walked the docks until his feet bled, searching the horizon for sails that were never meant to appear, his anxiety growing into a fever. Then came the rumors. The rival merchant had been seen at the northern gates, not leading a caravan, but fleeing with chests of silver, Elias's silver. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. The partnership had been a meticulously crafted illusion, a snare for a bird too proud to notice the net until it had already tightened. The debt he had guaranteed was now his alone to bear, and the creditors were not men of mercy or patience. The sun began to set on the day the note came due, casting long, bloody streaks across the marble floors of the counting room. Elias sat on the floor, the scroll lying open beside him, mockingly highlighting the words he had so arrogantly ignored. He had struck hands in pledge, and now the hunter was at the door. The sound of heavy iron boots began to echo against the stone of the outer courtyard. It was not the sound of friends or even customers. It was the rhythmic, terrifying march of the city guards. Sarah stood by the window, her face pale, but her gaze steady, watching as the authorities arrived to strip them of everything they owned. Elias looked at his hands, the hands that were supposed to be diligent and wise, and saw them shaking uncontrollably. The doors he had so proudly shut against the world were now being hammered open by the heavy reality of his own folly. The iron boots of the city guards thundered against the cedar doors, a sound that Elias had once associated with security, but now recognized as the drumbeat of his own ruin. Within hours, the luxury that defined his existence was stripped away with a clinical, cold efficiency. His fine linen robes were replaced by a coarse tunic that chafed his skin. The creditors did not stop at his gold. They took the tapestries and the very bed where he had sought a rest that never came. By the time the moon rose, Elias found himself standing in the mud of the lower city, the gates of his former life barred against him forever. He was led through the winding alleys of the slums and shoved into a room so small it felt more like a tomb than a dwelling. The walls were damp stone, and the only furniture was a straw mat that smelled of rot. In the darkness, Elias reached into his tunic, his fingers brushing against the only item the guards had deemed worthless: the ancient scroll. He unrolled it by the flickering light of a candle, his eyes blurring as he searched for hope. Instead, he found a mirror for his own hollow soul. The words of Ecclesiastes stared back, mocking his life's work. He who loves money will not be satisfied with money. This too is vanity. For years, Elias believed that the next chest of coins would finally bring peace. Now, sitting in the filth of the slums, he realized his hunger was a bottomless pit that no amount of gold could ever fill. As the night deepened, the silence became a canvas for his regrets. He closed his eyes and saw the faces of Sarah and his children as they were before the gold had become his god. He remembered the way Sarah used to hum, a sound he had eventually silenced with his endless talk of profit. He saw his children's smiles, which had withered into expressions of fear whenever he approached. The love he claimed to be building for them was actually a wall he had built around his ego, a fortification of coin that had eventually collapsed and buried them all. The weight of his selfishness pressed down on his chest, more suffocating than the cramped stone walls of the slum. In the fitful sleep that claimed him, Elias stood in a vast, golden hall where an elderly man sat with a tilted crown and weary eyes. It was King Solomon himself, surrounded by mountains of emeralds, yet he was weeping. The king reached out a hand, and as he did, the gold turned into grey ash that slipped through his fingers. "Everything is vanity," the king's voice echoed, a hollow sound. "A striving after the wind." Elias tried to catch the ash, but it blinded him. He realized then that Solomon was not a man to envy, but one who had seen the end of all material things and found them wanting. He woke with a start. He called for Sarah, but there was no answer. He scrambled to his feet, checking the corner where the children should have been, but found only shadows. Panic pierced his heart. Had the creditors taken them? Had the rival merchants' reach extended to his family's freedom? He rushed to the door, shouting their names into the street, but only the indifferent stares of the poor met his cries. He was utterly alone. Elias slumped against the wall, the reality of his isolation crashing over him. He had spent his life accumulating things, only to find that the only things that mattered were the people he had pushed away. In desperation, he reached into his pocket. There, tucked into a hidden seam, his nail caught on something hard. He pulled it out. It was a single gold coin, a solitary remnant of his former empire. It was enough to buy bread or a cloak. He looked at the coin, then at the broken world around him. The scroll waited on the floor as he pondered the true nature of sacrifice. He knew his hunger was great, yet the emptiness in his heart was far greater than any stomach's pang. The single gold coin felt unnervingly heavy in Elias's palm, its cold edge biting into his skin as if reminding him of its singular life-sustaining power. His stomach growled with a ferocity that made his vision blur, and the scent of baking bread wafting from a distant stall felt like a cruel taunt. This coin was his final defense against the void. It represented a loaf of bread, a flagon of water, or a night in a room that didn't smell of damp earth and rotting straw. He began to walk toward the market, his feet moving by instinct, his mind mechanically calculating the calories he could buy to survive the night. As he turned a corner, his gaze fell upon a figure huddled against a crumbling stone wall. She was a widow, her garments little more than grey rags that offered no warmth. Her eyes were hollowed by a hunger that Elias now recognized as a reflection of his own. Beside her, a small child lay listless, too weak even to cry for the milk he lacked. Elias stopped, the coin hidden in his clenched fist. The old Elias whispered that survival was for the cunning, that the weak were merely friction in the machinery of commerce. Yet the words of the Solomon scroll pulsed in his mind. One gives freely, yet grows all the richer. He looked at the widow and pressed the gold coin into her calloused, trembling palm. She gasped, her fingers closing over the small fortune. For a moment the silence was thick with an energy that gold had never bought him before. He felt a sudden, inexplicable lightness. The paradox was immediate. His stomach was still empty, yet his spirit felt nourished. "May the God of Solomon remember your mercy," she whispered. She looked at him then, eyes widening in recognition. "You are the merchant from the high district. I saw your wife, Sarah, and your children yesterday. They were being led away by a man with hands calloused from honest timber and eyes full of compassion." Elias felt a jolt of hope. "Where?" The widow pointed toward the western gate. "To the house of Caleb the foreman. He told them they would find a bed in a house built on grace." The walk to the western gate was the longest journey of Elias's life. His fine leather boots were gone, replaced by thin sandals that offered no protection against the sharp stones of the road. Each step was a lesson in humility. He passed the warehouses he once owned, seeing the seals of other men on the doors, and realized he didn't miss the inventory. He missed the sound of Caleb's laughter, a sound he had traded for the clinking of silver. When he finally reached the modest timber house, he stood at the door for a long time, unable to knock. To enter was to admit he was a failure. It was to face the man he had treated as a mere tool. Finally, the door creaked open. Caleb stood there, his large frame silhouetted by the warm glow of a hearth fire. There was no mockery in his gaze, only a quiet sadness that shifted into relief. "I wondered how long it would take for the scroll to lead you here," Caleb said softly, stepping aside to let him in. Inside, the air smelled of roasted grain and herbs. Sarah emerged from the shadows, her eyes red from weeping. But as they landed on Elias, a look of cautious hope dawned. The children ran to him, their small arms wrapping around his waist, and for the first time, Elias did not calculate the cost of the time he spent holding his own family. As they sat around Caleb's simple wooden table, eating a meal of lentils and coarse bread, Elias realized the profound mystery of generosity. He had given away his last coin and received his family in return. He had lost his palace and found a true home. Caleb spoke of the dignity of honest labor, and Elias listened with the hunger of a man who had finally found the bread of life. However, the peace was suddenly shattered by a sharp rapping at the door. A messenger from the city council stood there with a parchment sealed with the judge's crest. There was a legal loophole to reclaim the estate, but it required a character witness to testify to Elias's integrity. He looked at Caleb and knew his future rested in the hands of the one he wronged. The sun climbed slowly over the jagged horizon, painting the city's limestone walls in hues of bruised purple and gold. Elias stood before the massive bronze doors of the Hall of Judgment, his heart drumming a frantic rhythm against his ribs. This was the threshold of his former life. Behind these doors lay the chance to reclaim the silk robes, the cedar-lined chambers, and the prestige that had once been his oxygen. But as he adjusted the coarse, borrowed tunic from Caleb, he felt the weathered parchment of the Solomon's scroll pressed against his chest. It was a physical reminder of the journey he had taken from the heights of arrogance to the dust of the slums. Beside him, Sarah gripped his hand, her silence a steadying force. Yet her eyes mirrored the anxiety of a woman who knew their entire future rested on the words her husband was about to speak. Before he could enter, a man stepped from the shadows of a nearby pillar. It was a clerk Elias had once bribed to overlook discrepancies in his shipping manifests. The man leaned in close, his breath smelling of sour wine and secrets. He whispered that the legal loophole was wide enough for a fleet of ships to pass through, provided Elias testified that the rival merchant had used sorcery or physical threats to coerce the signature on the deed of transfer. It was a simple, elegant lie that would satisfy the letter of the law and return the palace keys to Elias's pocket by sunset. The old Elias, the man who viewed every person as a pawn and every truth as a commodity, screamed at him to take the deal. The palace was not just a house. It was safety for his children and a shield against the cold cruelty of the world he had just escaped. Elias looked at the clerk, then down at the scroll. The words he had read by Caleb's hearth fire flared in his mind. The integrity of the upright guides them, but the unfaithful are destroyed by their duplicity. He realized that to regain his house through a lie would be to build a mansion on a foundation of quicksand. He would be back in the golden prison of his own making, forever looking over his shoulder, forever counting the cost of his soul. With a firm shake of his head, he pushed past the clerk and entered the hall. The air inside was cool and heavy, with the scent of old parchment and the sweat of nervous men. The judge sat upon a raised dais, his face a mask of impartial stone, flanked by the very elders Elias had once snubbed in his pursuit of absolute market dominance. When Elias was called to the stand, a heavy silence descended upon the room. He could see Caleb sitting in the back, his weathered hands folded, his eyes watching with a quiet intensity. Elias began to speak, but the words that came out were not the rehearsed legalities the clerk had suggested. Instead, he spoke with a raw, terrifying honesty that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. He confessed to his greed, describing in vivid detail how he had valued the glint of a coin over the heartbeat of his workers. He admitted that the deal with the rival merchant had been born of his own vanity, an attempt to prove he was greater than the legends of old. He spoke of the warehouse accident and the coldness with which he had viewed Caleb's departure. He offered no excuses, seeking no mercy, fully expecting the judge to finalize his ruin and send him to the debtor's prison for the rest of his natural life. As he finished, the courtroom remained paralyzed by the weight of his confession. The judge leaned forward, his silver eyebrows knitting together in confusion. Never in his years on the bench had he heard a merchant speak the truth to his own detriment. But before he could pass sentence, the heavy doors at the back of the hall burst open. A group of city guards entered, dragging a disheveled figure between them. It was the rival merchant, his fine clothes torn and his face pale with terror. He had been captured at the mountain pass, carrying trunks filled with the gold and deeds he had stolen from Elias and several other families. The shadowy figure who had been watching Elias from the start stepped forward, revealing himself to be a royal investigator who had used Elias's downfall as bait to catch the greater criminal. The judge looked from the trembling rival merchant to the humble man standing in the dock. He signaled for silence as the recovered wealth was catalogued. Then, turning his gaze back to Elias, the judge spoke with a voice that carried the weight of destiny. He declared that because Elias had shown a rare integrity in the face of absolute loss, the law would favor his restoration. The rival merchant was led away to the dungeons, and the deeds to the estate were placed upon the table. The judge offered Elias a choice that hung in the air like a shimmering blade. He could take back his entire empire, every coin and every stone, and return to the life he once knew. Or he could accept a restructured settlement that would pay his debts, but leave him with a much humbler existence. The court waited, breathless, to see if the merchant had truly learned the lesson of the scroll, or if the lure of the golden throne would prove too strong to resist. Elias stood firmly at the center of the ancient hall of judgment, the judge's question hanging like heavy incense. The courtroom air was thick with anticipation. Every eye in the hall remained fixed upon him as he made the choice that would define his future. Before him lay the path back to the man he once was, a man of power, secluded behind cedar walls. Beside that path lay a simpler one, paved with the dust of the streets. He looked at Sarah, whose eyes held a quiet hope, not for the return of silks, but for the man she had rediscovered. He stood as a man stripped of his pride, but clothed in a newfound dignity that no merchant's gold could purchase. Elias addressed the judge, declining the full restoration of his former empire. He requested only enough to settle every debt his greed had incurred, and to provide a modest roof. The remainder, a fortune that would have made kings envious, he pledged to a trust for the city's poor, a living monument to the lessons written on the weathered parchment against his chest. In the months that followed, the city watched a transformation more profound than any temple. Elias, once a silent predator in the market, was now seen among the stalls with a genuine smile. He spent his days in the warehouse, no longer as a distant master, but working side by side with Caleb, their hands stained with the same dust. Caleb, once a critic, now stood as his most loyal advisor and brother. The warehouse was no longer a factory of exhaustion, but a place of dignity. Elias ensured every worker was paid fairly, and that rest was honored as sacred. He discovered that the diligence of the soul was not about the hours spent laboring, but about the spirit in which work was done. His reputation, once built on fear, was now rebuilt on the bedrock of integrity. One evening, as moonlight spilled across the courtyard of his new stone house, Elias sat with the ancient scroll spread across his knees. He had reached the final section, the ink faded but the truth burning brighter than any lantern. The ancient ink seemed to shimmer under the stars. He read aloud, "The blessing of the Lord makes rich, and he adds no sorrow with it." He paused, letting the realization wash over him. His previous wealth had been heavy, with the sorrow of neglected children and a lonely wife. This new life, though financially modest, was light. There was no shadow of guilt trailing his footsteps. He was rich, not in the weight of his purse, but in the peace of his spirit. Inside, the scent of roasting lamb wafted from the kitchen. Sarah called him to the table, and for the first time, Elias did not hesitate. He left his ledgers at the threshold. As they sat together, the oil lamps casting a warm glow, Elias looked at his children. They were telling stories, their voices filled with energy he had previously been too distracted to notice. The bread was coarse and the table was simple wood, but the feast felt more royal than any banquet he had hosted in his palace. True abundance was not found in the silence of a vault, but in the vibrant life of a home. He realized the greatest dividend he had ever earned was the sound of their laughter. He wasn't counting coins, he was counting the smiles around the table. In Sarah's eyes, he saw the man he had become, one who understood that true prosperity was measured in the quality of his relationships, not his assets. As the meal ended, Elias called his eldest son to his side. He placed the weathered scroll in the boy's hands. The boy looked at the parchment with reverence, sensing the weight of the wisdom it held. Elias leaned in, his hand on his son's shoulder, whispering the final warning, "Watch your heart, my son, for everything you do flows from it." The boy nodded, and as the family moved toward rest, a final shot of the scroll showed the ink glowing in the dying embers. The legacy of Solomon was no longer a dream of gold, but a reality of character, a treasure that neither thieves could steal nor time could ever erode.